Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. My name is Sebastian Moore.
And I'm hilary.salt.
And this is going to be a bit weird because we recorded something a couple of days ago, but we've been having a lot of technical difficulties. And I think we've got your news story from that episode, I think is fine, we can put out.
Okay.
Which is about the budget deficit.
Budget deficits, yes.
So hopefully we're going to splice that together with this and we'll have something to show you today. But do bear with us. And we are, can we announce that we're moving office?
We can, yeah.
Okay.
I think so, yeah.
We're moving a grand total of, 3 metres? 5 metres?
Yeah, more of like 5, I would say.
Just that way. To a bigger office. So we will have a bit more space and hopefully we can have a sort of permanent podcast setup, which will help because we have to make this every single time.
We do.
And it takes us a bit of time and then we mess things up and so forth. But okay, today we're going to talk about, as well as the budget deficit, which hopefully we can put in somewhere, we're going to talk about...
making the best of Brexit.
And a lot of people will hear that and think, what are you talking about, Legxit? Like Luxembourg leaving the EU.
Legxit meaning a left-wing version and appreciation of Brexit.
Okay, so this is there were a lot of people in the Brexit referendum, which was, and the reason we're doing this is that it was 9 years ago this week that Britain voted to leave the EU.
Yes.
And a lot of the media coverage focused on what I would say is the right-wing version of Brexit, and that those like Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson at the time, Michael Gove. You know, there were a lot of people on the right that were advocating for Britain to leave the EU, and there wasn't much media coverage of people on the left, even though it's a traditional viewpoint of the left. The traditional left were sceptical of the European Union or the EEC as it was.
Yeah.
So we went to this event, didn't we? Maybe you could tell everyone a bit about this event.
Yeah, so this was an event organised by Richard Johnson of the Queen Mary University of London, which was trying to bring together left voices on Brexit to understand perhaps why the opportunities offered by Brexit haven't been made the most of. And perhaps to try to reformulate what is the appropriate left-wing case for Brexit. So, as you say, what we tend to focus on, the media in particular tends to focus on, is the kind of Singapore-on-Sea version of
Singapore on
Brexit.
Thames.
Singapore on Thames, if you like.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Whereas there are certainly opportunities that arise from Brexit that could be used in a more traditional left-wing view. Okay.
So to start us off, what is the left-wing reason for wanting to leave the European Union?
So there's a lot of different speakers at the conference, and perhaps to pick out one, Paul Embry. So he talked about the fact that the EU is irretrievably anti-socialist. So it doesn't like Keynesianism, ways of kind of reinvigorating the economy. It doesn't like the state intervening to assist industries that are struggling. All that was outlawed by the EU under their kind of state aid requirements. I do remember right back in the 1974-75 discussions on the on Europe, I always remember walking to school and quite a lot of people had stickers in their cars, like people do. And I always remember that one of them was, the common market is a boss's market. And that was the traditional left-wing view, that it was very much pro-big business and anti the rights and interests of ordinary working people. So I think the way we rescue a kind of form of Brexit that plays upon some of those aspirations that ordinary working people have is to try to look again at what the opportunities are. So at the conference, Richard Johnson, who introduced it, said that he kind of pointed out the fact that there's a lot of dissatisfaction with Brexit, even amongst Leave voters. And his analysis was that what the current government are trying to do is to roll back on it to kind of address that dissatisfaction. But he pointed out, he had a fantastic phrase. He said that Brexit was a constitutional decision, not a policy decision. You know, so it was about, the phrase was always taking back control, wasn't it? But you might imagine that we might take back that control in a way that allowed, for example, more redistribution of wealth, more ways of levelling up, ways in which you can use Brexit to really free up the economy and reinvigorate the not just services, but, you know, manufacturing industries. He just took an example of we could use Brexit to effectively give cheap finance to the fishing industry and rebuild our fishing industries. Because he said, you know, okay, it's true that the fishing industries aren't a massive part of the UK economy, but look how important they are to some other European countries. And actually, they could be a much bigger part of our economy. And they are so important to our coastal communities.
So just on fishing, because this came in the, if you remember the EU-UK pact that we discussed a few weeks back.
Yeah.
And I remember watching Question Time that week, and there was some talk about how the fishing industry in the UK had been sold out because it was the rights for the EU to fish in our waters were coming to an end, and they've been extended now for something like 12 years.
That's right.
And a lot of the argument, whether this was by people in the audience or by politicians on the panel, was that, the fishing only makes up 0.5% of our GDP or something like that. And I thought that's such a weird way of looking at the world. And Richard Johnson, who convened this conference on Monday, he said, but it's really important to those communities.
Exactly.
Right? It's 100% important to the people that are in those, you know, in that line of work. And I think it's so strange, and this is something I really dislike in the way we discuss politics, where we look at it as just numbers and economics, and you say, that's not important. You know, you only lose a few jobs there. And I think, well, it's really, really important to those people and those communities.
That's right. Yes, absolutely. I definitely agree with that. Yeah. So, lost my train of thought a little bit there, but we were talking about, you know, what opportunities could we make the most of post Brexit, and I think there are perhaps a question that came up time and time again during the day is rethinking what we mean by the national interest. So, what does it mean when we talk about the national interest? And one of the speakers was Philip Cunliffe. And I don't want to say too much about what he said because we're going to have him on as a podcast guest in a couple of weeks' time. So I don't want to spoil his thunder. But he was talking very much about how do we define the national interest. Again, there was some really nice turns of phrase yesterday, and he said that the UK still behaves like a member state, not a nation state. And our political elites haven't understood that it's a completely different way of looking at the world when you are a nation state. And for so long, we've not thought about what is in the national interest. And we really need to think about what is in the national interest.
Yeah. Well, it's also interesting when you think about the UK, and I think Philip Cunliffe and Peter Ramsey, who we had on before, have made this point that realistically, it was only a nation state between the post-war years and when we went into the EEC.
Yeah.
You know, because we had an empire before that, which
Correct.
is a very, very different thing.
Yeah.
So it's a very different way of looking at it. And I'd never thought of that before, that the post-war British state wasn't actually around for that much time, 30 years.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. One of the speakers, Tara McCormack, was talking about some of the examples of where the government have behaved completely against the interests of the nation state. So she used the example of the negotiation or authorization of our nuclear deterrent, which is effectively organised with the US. And previously that was reauthorised every 10 years by Parliament. And the Labour government just taken that option away from Parliament and are now effectively agreeing it directly with the US. So, she kind of pointed out that isn't that isn't the way in which a nation state should behave, in terms of its democracy. So it's a decision not made by the people, but not even made by Westminster, made in America. And she looked at the use of the I think called the Storm Force missiles or something like that. Storm Shadow missiles, yeah, that were used in Ukraine. So government effectively agreed that they could be used for very long range targeting into Russian territory. And again, not something that's taken to Parliament. Parliament didn't get a decision on that. Made very much by the executive. And if we want to hold on to the idea of the UK as a democratic nation state, we really need to be objecting to some of these ways in which government are behaving.
Yes. Yes, that's all I've got to say to that.
I think you made a comment earlier today, didn't you, that quite often some of the, I don't want to use right wing, but some of the perhaps anti-liberal commentators will tend to say things like, this is the way I think the world should be, and it would be nice if we could get there through democracy, but if we can't, perhaps we'll use other methods. And that's deeply authoritarian, isn't it, as a way of looking at the world? And I think there's those anti-liberals who are very authoritarian, and there's the liberals like the Labour Party who are very authoritarian. And I think for both of those occasions, we need to really stand up and object.
Absolutely. And I think it's well worth remembering that this idea of being pro-democracy is not just something that's reserved for the people that voted to leave the EU. And there'll be a large coalition that can be made with people that voted to remain, people that voted to leave, but are still pro-democracy and pro, the views of the British public being represented in our sovereign parliament. And Rennie Anger,
yes,
if I'm saying his name right, who came to speak and was on the panel that you chaired.
Yeah,
he made this argument because he's done a lot of polling, looking at people that voted to leave and people that voted to remain. He said it's a lot more nuanced than you think. The media paints it as one way or another, and I think it's worth remembering that there's that coalition to be made, because a lot of people that voted for to leave the EU will have been doing it for completely different reasons than why you would have voted to leave the EU.
Yeah.
And like we said at the start of this, that there were some people that wanted the Singapore on Thames, because let's just say to leave the EU, you're leaving the customs union, which means you can then you can make your own trade agreements with different countries, because when you're in the EU, you have to make those agreements as part of the EU, so you're not allowed to do them yourselves, right?
Yeah.
Now, that might be because you want free trade with all these countries all over the world, or it might be that you don't want any trade whatsoever.
That's right.
So you could vote to leave, and you could want to leave for completely different reasons. And I think what we've seen is that the right-wing version has sort of been enacted, and I know people on the right will say, no, it wasn't enacted, but we've seen what the Conservatives, at least, what they did with Brexit, and it's just empty. It's completely vapid. Can you say vapid?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the right word?
Yeah.
And I think now what we have to see is a movement of people and it's people like Philip Cunliffe, who I think is absolutely brilliant, and I'm really looking forward to him coming on the podcast. He's putting forward some really interesting ideas, and I think those are the ideas we can take and run with.
Yes.
And actually build something going forward that has longevity.
And I think we are already running with some of those ideas. So something that somebody else mentioned yesterday, I can't remember who said it now, was around tariffs. And, as you know, we've been generally very pro thinking about tariffs. And somebody made the point that the traditional left view, the traditional Labour Party view, was that you would have tariffs on manufactured products, but free trade on food, which actually was news to me. I didn't know that was the traditional left view. But certainly, as you say, what Brexit does open up is the ability to potentially protect your manufacturing base through tariffs. And we've made the point before, haven't we, that some of those things we think are really worth looking at. So I think we're already running with some of these ideas.
Yeah.
And it was what was nice, I thought, about the conference was to see that some of those ideas are actually sprouting out in other places. So it is good that I think we're getting a bit more of a discussion and a debate going about, not just following the Singapore on Thames approach.
Yes. Can I mention Jonathan Hinder?
You can.
Shout out to Jonathan Hinder. So he's
Yes.
a Labour MP for Pendle and Clitheroe, which is up in Lancashire, just north of here.
Clitheroe.
And how did I say it?
Clitheroe.
Clitheroe. Is that too southern?
Yeah.
Clitheroe. Is that right?
Clitheroe.
And I had a chat with him afterwards, and I was really impressed with him. And he said something. I just wanted to point this out because I said, "You won me over with your first sentence, Jonathan," because he first thing he said was, "I have come in as a Labour MP, and I've got a majority of 900." He said, "So I'm in Parliament for a good time, not a long time." And I thought, that's the spirit. That's what I want to see from members of Parliament.
Yeah.
That they say, I'm not here thinking about my re-election next time and trying to manage that. I'm here to do something. And he's trying to push the Labour government into a position of more, what we might say, more sanity.
Yeah.
I think, I think for what it's worth, it's a fruitless endeavour because I just don't think, I think that party's just completely gone. And I think there were a lot of people there on Monday that were struggling to come to terms with that. And I think it's for us as a party, the SDP, to show that there's much more hope in a new insurgent movement like this than through a sclerotic old Labour Party.
I think we're not impartial in this, are we? But no,
not at all.
I do agree with you. There were just occasions when at the conference where you felt like you were maybe intruding on private grief a little bit.
Yes.
There was a really interesting speaker who's David Littlefair, who's has an organisation called the Blue Collar Parliament. And he was making the point that the Labour Party these days never pick as a candidate a working class person. So they've become completely mesmerised by the idea of the professionalisation of politics, and they'll always pick a barrister or a professional or an expert or a think tank person over an electrician or even a teacher or an ordinary person.
I'm trying to think who it was that said when you criticise this, often the response is, "Well, we've got Angela Rayner, haven't we?"
Yeah. Yes. Indeed. Yeah. So, as I said, there were times where you felt that this is not really our discussion to have, and obviously, the Labour Party needs to have those discussions itself. But I think the point that you made is right, that actually, where you have a quite nimble, smaller organisation, it's much more able to influence it. And we've talked before, haven't we, about there's a really clear process for SDP members to influence policy. We're just about to kick off our new round of policy discussions. So I have a call later today where we're going to decide what are the 3 policies we're going to have next up in our list of things to review or have a new policy on. So if people are really interested in policy, it's a good time to join the party.
Yeah, and I would say also that the word that kept cropping up for me on Monday was bravery. And I was thinking about how, I have a lot of sympathy for this, but a lot of those people that were there on Monday are in the Labour Party or in their positions, and they know that if they stick their head above the parapet, or if they step out and they join another party, their livelihood is at risk. You've said this before, that their social life often is at risk.
Yeah.
And it is a brave thing to do, to join a party like the SDP. Mm-hmm. What I would say is, what you're doing if you're staying in the Labour Party is you're fighting a losing battle. Right, that party is gone. You join a party like the SDP that you actually believe in what they're saying, and yes, it's going to be hard. It's a difficult road and it's a long road, but it's the brave thing to do because at least you're fighting for something that you believe in.
I agree. Can I mention the R word?
Go on.
So one of the other speakers was Maurice Glassman, Lord Glassman, and I thought what was really interesting about what he said was he was saying we need to be talking to reform. We, meaning the Labour Party, from his point of view. And I thought that was quite a brave thing to say, but quite interesting, really, that Because it does suggest that the Labour Party are recognising the fact that they don't have kind of direct routes to talk to ordinary working people, and maybe that is a route. So I'm not sure it will work for them, but it's interesting that they are perhaps grappling with the problem.
Last thing from me. My favourite moment of the day was in one of the sessions in the afternoon, and Michael Gove came in and sat in front of me. He was now Lord Gove of Tory.
Yeah.
And you made a contribution from the floor, because that was the one where you weren't sharing, you were in the audience. And you made this, do you want to repeat what you said about the market?
Yeah, so this was in the session where we're talking about the economy, and they've been, the contributors were talking a lot about things like nationalisation. So Peter Ramsey was speaking on that one, and he made the point that actually nationalisation is very difficult for a government that doesn't have any political capital to do. So it was very different to the post-war Labour government, who did have a lot of political capital there. But I made the point that actually a big contribution to the economy could be made by government kind of getting out rather than government intervening. So, two examples of that. There are, I can't remember the number. I think it's about 3 million or even 4 million people on universal credit who are in work, which I think is a direct subsidy to employers paying poor wages. So it's kind of corporate welfareism. People say the welfare bill is too high, but half of that is a blooming subsidy to corporate big businesses. And also, there's a real push towards monopolisation. So the kind of way in which government requires really extensive credentialisation, quality marks and all those kind of things, it means it's really hard for small businesses to compete. So the business that I used to run, whenever we tendered for public service contracts, that one of the first questions on the list is, do you already provide services to government? And if you responded no, you couldn't go any further. And it's a restraint of trade, and it does, cause monopolisation. So my point was, government needs to get out as well as intervene. It's not just about intervention, it's about stopping doing some of the things it's doing now.
So it was a really good point, I thought, and something you might not be expecting to hear at a left-wing conference. And as you said it, Michael Gove, who of course was a Conservative minister, he sort of did that, and he startled a bit, and he was sat in front of me, and as he did so, he kicked his cup of tea, which was on the floor, and spilt his tea. And I thought that was brilliant.
Good.
You shocked Michael Gove.
That's good. Good to know. He follows me on Twitter,
Does he?
On X, yeah.
He should come on the podcast. We'll have him on.
Maybe ask him, yeah.
Great.
So budget deficit.
Mm-hmm.
So you know what that is, presumably.
Budget deficit is when you don't have enough money.
Yeah.
To pay for the things in your budget.
Correct. Yeah. So for a country, the deficit or the borrowing requirement is the difference between the income and the outgo. Now, it's measured monthly, and that's why it's in the news. So I'll come to that in a minute, but I thought maybe just do a few little intro points first. So last financial years run from April to April in the UK, we had about 1.1 trillion income and about 1.2 trillion outgo. So we had an overall deficit of, I think the actual number is 131 billion, which is, I think it's 4.7 or something like that % of GDP. But it's about £2,000 per person in the UK. So it's big. Yeah. It's really big.
Yeah, this is, that's a lot of information.
It's
I know that in, I suppose, in the politics world is quite just simple. It's, what was it, 131 billion deficit, 4.7% of GDP.
Yeah.
What that means is that's the difference between what you're spending and what you're bringing in.
Correct.
And how much of a percentage that is for your gross domestic product,
yes.
which is a total valuation of all goods and services each year in a country.
Yeah, which I think is about 2.6 trillion for the UK GDP. So we are kind of living beyond our means. It's just the same as when you look at your bank account at the end of the month and your income is less than your outgoings. Yeah, it's a similar problem. We've not had a budget surplus for a long time, since about the year 2000. And obviously everything got a lot worse during COVID. So I think in COVID we had deficits of around about 15% a year in that 2020-21 year. And obviously that's because both the bottom line and the top line of the kind of fraction are problematic, because we had a lot more outgo because government was paying things like furlough and those loans it made to businesses to kind of tide them over. And at the same time, overall production was also falling because lots of people weren't working. So, a real problem during the pandemic. So what happens to that 131 billion? Where does that 131 billion that we don't have come from?
How do we get it?
Yeah.
Because we need it, don't we?
Yeah.
If we're spending it. We borrow it.
We borrow it, yes, that's right. So in the same way that you might take out an overdraft with your bank, the government issues government bonds to the market. And do you remember we did a big episode on government bonds and discount rates?
Yeah. But this is why we want borrowing costs to be low if we're borrowing money.
Absolutely.
And why often the opposition will say borrowing costs have skyrocketed.
Yes.
As an attack on the government.
Correct. And obviously the more bonds that the government issues, you increase the supply. So the price of those bonds goes down. So the yield on those bonds goes up. Do you remember all this?
I know, price down, yield up.
Yeah, great.
How long have we been doing this podcast? I don't know, like probably 9 months or so. That might be the only thing I've learned.
Well, that's good.
And it might be enough.
So it's a good thing to learn. So it's in the news. The reason I was looking at this is because it's in the news, because we just had May's deficit figures. So obviously everything's a bit, behind schedule because they have to do all the measuring. And what I thought was quite interesting was the different ways in which different people treated this news. So the Times headline, I'm just going to read this out. The Times headline was, UK borrowing falls in May after higher tax on businesses. Okay.
Uh-huh.
And that is kind of true. So 17.7 billion was what was needed in May to fund that gap between income and outgoings. And that was below, the Times were saying, that was below the forecast of about 18 billion. Now, I kind of think that is pretty much bob on, the forecast of about 18 billion. But they painted it as being a bit less. Other people have painted it in different ways. So AOL online, not your normal newspaper, but it's interesting.
AOL online
it still exists.
What was in the AOL that we'd have used for email and
presume
internet?
So, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. They said UK borrowing rises in May, making tax hikes more necessary. So they were painting it as a bad news story. The OBR, announced these numbers as in a kind of official statistic, and they say latest government receipts remain close to forecast. And I think, to be honest, that is the reality, is that things are about where we thought they would be. Because obviously the Chancellor knew that she'd put up national insurance rates, so she knew that receipts were going to go up through that. I guess the thing that's a bit disappointing is that things aren't getting better because we've got more growth and people are making more widgets and we've got more production and therefore taxes are going up. It's not that's not what's happening. So receipts are up because of the national insurance increase. Interestingly, debt interest is down a bit. And the reason for that is that when we talked before about government bonds, we talked about what you'd call fixed interest bonds. And I still think the majority of the debt that government issues is fixed interest, but it also issues what are called index-linked bonds.
Yeah.
Which pay a rate of return plus whatever inflation is. And because inflation had come down a little bit, the interest payments that government was making on those index-linked bonds had come down a bit. So that's the reason why things are perhaps slightly better than expected, but actually pretty much bob on track.
And we'll still be paying off debt from bonds that were issued a while ago that will have different borrowing costs, right?
Correct, that's right. But even if it's a debt that's issued a long time ago, most often government want to roll that debt over. So maybe they issued a debt in 1990 and it was a 20-year one. So it expired in 2010. they don't just repay that debt and not do anything. What they do is they issue a new debt to replace the old debt. So if discount rates have gone up in the meantime, that means their new borrowing is more expensive than their old borrowing. So it's not that things are just repaid and, we draw a line. So you've automatically there, I think you have in your head there, drawn a distinction between deficit and debt, which is important. Yeah. So deficit is a kind of what happens every month, and debt is the whole stack of debt that we've built up over the past. And the whole stack of debts that we've built up in the past is now about 96.4% of GDP.
Yeah, it runs around 100% of GDP for the last few years, and I think it went over that during the pandemic.
Yeah. But I mean, ideally, you would want to get that down to maybe about half. It's not that we're outliers, though, compared to the other G7 or other, developed countries. So lots of people are in much the same boat.
Some in worse things. Japan is way out at something huge, 200% of GDP or something crazy.
Yes.
Without having the figures to hand.
Yes, you've done that. Let's guess a number there. Yeah. So the other kind of thing just to keep an eye on, that I do keep an eye on this, is the 20-year bond yield. That's around about 5.2 now, and it has been that for a few months now. It's relatively steady.
So if the government wanted to borrow some money, and they buy this or they issue this 20-year bond, and people will buy it, which means that they give the government the money, and the government says, brilliant, we can go and spend that money now.
Yes.
And the government, over the course of 20 years, will have to pay back 5.2% on top of the original amount.
That's right.
Okay. That thing that I've just explained, right, sounds so simple, and yet I think for most of my life I've been walking around not understanding that.
Yeah. So it's worth doing the podcast, isn't it? Because now you know that. So I think that's probably all I wanted to say. I mean, it's not kind of massively interesting news. In that the news is that we're about where we thought we'd be, but I guess things could be a lot worse. And it's something that I think we will probably keep returning to, because the country's finances are, the bedrock on which everything else we need to build is dependent.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that's me.
Very good. All right, we finished?
Yes. I think we've got enough to satisfy our
keep
listenership.
the punters happy.
Yeah. We should perhaps say, though, that we have now, you're going on holiday and I'm going on holiday. So it's possible we may not get a podcast out next week. So you might have to be waiting a couple of weeks for the next one. But we've got some really good guests lined up. So definitely keep watching.
Good stuff. All right. Thanks for listening.
Thanks all.